Welcome to Forthright. I'm Sue Lonnie Madsen, podcasting today with a very personal column with some reader feedback on the column and unscripted commentary on the impact of a visit to the KGB Museum in Vilnius, Lithuania, and the Museum of Terror in Budapest, Hungary. But first, the column. As published Thursday, April 13th, 2023 in the Spokesman Review, this I believe. Braver Angels Central and Eastern Washington Alliance recently asked members to write essays in the format of Edward R. Murrow's This I Believe program, describing experiences that have shaped the unique ways we each view the world. This was my contribution, written to be read aloud as I contemplated an upcoming opportunity to visit the memorial to the 1956 Hungarian Revolution on a long-planned trip to Europe. More lessons from that trip in future columns, but today, this I believe. I believe in the search for meaning and purpose. One of my favorite childhood TV programs was Hogan's Heroes. Colonel Robert E. Hogan and his gang of dashing American, British, and French prisoners of war really ran the camp under the noses of the nervous Colonel Wilhelm Klink and his sidekick, Sergeant Hans Schultz. "I know nothing," was Sergeant Schultz's cry as the prisoners carried out some plot. My father had been an electronics tech in the Coast Guard, and I admired Staff Sergeant James Michener keeping the radio equipment running, plus rising to any other technological challenges. He was the token Schwarzerman. African Americans on TV in my youth were cast as the smart ones, the reliable ones. The characters of Kinch, Nyota Uhura on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, and Alexander Scott on I Spy were admirable role models. Germans were portrayed as dolts or devils. My maiden name is recognizably German, and my paternal grandparents were first and second generation German immigrants. My father had been teased as a seventh grader in northern New Jersey during the Second World War because his name sounded very much like the name of an infamous U-boat captain picking off ships as they left New York Harbor. I did not want to be German. I turned to reading World War II history in junior high. Stories of courageous men landing on the beach in Normandy, brave women serving as combat nurses or spies, members of the French resistance, ordinary British stepping up during the Blitz. It was all very exciting. But as I got older and dug deeper, I began to absorb a more robust picture of war. A memoir of the firebombing of Dresden, as told by an American woman married to a German diplomat who had been trapped in Dresden with her children. John Hershey's tale of Hiroshima. Recognizing parents and grandparents of my Japanese-American classmates had been interned by the U.S. government. I admired the courage of all those who fought the fight in front of them. And then I read and reread and reread The Bridge at Andau by James Michener. He was a working reporter at the bridge, a crossing point for Hungarians fleeing the Russians after the 1956 uprising in Budapest. He recorded their stories of life behind the Iron Curtain, of parents deprogramming their children from the lies taught at school, asking each other, "Is it time for the talk?" Afraid of being turned in by children, neighbors, and coworkers for thinking or saying the wrong thing, of KGB torture chambers and mindless inhumanity, all in the name of governmental power. It was hard to understand, sitting in a free America, how people could become so cruel, how government could exercise such power over their lives. During the uprising, it was teenagers who ran out into the streets under fire from Russian soldiers to jam a piece of lead pipe into a tank tread. Once stopped, others would toss a Molotov cocktail in the hatch. It was tragic. It was exciting. It was courageous. Could I have done it? Would I have done it? Is there anything I believe in so strongly that I would run out in front of a tank with a piece of pipe to jam in the treads? It was a hard question. It's still a question that inspires me when meeting metaphorical tanks. I try not to lob too many Molotov cocktails. Sometimes words will do to stop a tank in its tracks. And a postscript, the lesson was reinforced after visiting the 1956 memorial and the museum located in the old headquarters of the secret police. While government is an essential social tool, it is a terrible master. That's the column as I shared it in the Spokesman Review. It's kind of funny how that came about because I had written it for this other purpose for the Brave Angels meeting. And the column that I had written for that day happened to talk about land disputes and tribalism among humans. And as it turned out, my editor discovered kind of at the last minute that there was going to be a front page story that dealt with land disputes and conflicts between tribes. And they were afraid that the column, as I had submitted it, was going to look awkward. So they pulled that one. It was printed the next week, and I pulled this one off the shelf, so to speak, and we used it. And I am glad that I shared it because it does tell you a lot about an impactful book that has that is a background to how I see and interpret the world. Well, the bridge at Andau had many stories of mindless torture with no point other than to terrorize a society to follow the party line, describing in detail the methods used to force people to turn in fellow citizens. One of the survivors, interviewed for the Museum of Terror exhibit in Budapest in the old secret police headquarters building, told of his fervent prayer before being led into torture. Lord, let me forget the names of my friends, lest I drag them in. And I usually script my podcast so I don't get tongue-tied, and I can do it in one take for sure. Today I want to tell a couple of stories I've told to friends over the last 15 years, and we'll see how it goes. The stories in the Bridge of Andau certainly impacted me as a teenager, and they're there as a part of my background, my background lens. We all have background lenses, but they'd really faded over time until a 2008 international trip with ag forestry to Latvia, Lithuania, and Russia. We had very engaged local guides. We had some homestays. We were able to hear stories of, these were guides that were relatively young people who still had stories from their grandparents of the Russians coming in, of fighting back, hiding in the forests into the 1960s to fight back against Soviet aggression in the Baltics, Latvia and Lithuania. The history was still very much alive there. And that threat of invasion is why Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as soon as they regained independence from the Soviet Union, they pushed to be full members of both the European Union and NATO. And they're counting on us to come to their rescue if Russia invades. That makes me a little nervous as I hear the news out of Ukraine. So we're on this tour, and we had been traveling for about 5 or 6 days, and we're in Vilnius, Lithuania. And we have a free afternoon. For once, there's no tours programmed, and we look at the map, and some of us decide that we think it'd be funny to go to the KGB museum in Lithuania. It all sounds like kind of just silly cloak and dagger stuff. And the printer is going to go off behind me because I think my husband's printing something. I think I'm going to break here and I'll come back. Okay, so we had decided that we were going to go follow up on the Cloak and Dagger KGB Museum, and the main floor was a lot of displays of things that we'd been hearing about on the trip, pictures of families that were shipped off to Siberia, pictures of breadlines, pictures of internment camps in Siberia, a lot of those kinds of personal stories, all in black and white. It's easy to walk through a museum and look at those, and they don't really connect, right? It's easy to kind of just pass them off as it's old history. We went down to the basement, and the basement, they had not changed. This was a building about 5, 6 stories tall in the center of town, and what the people said about it was, well, you can see Siberia from there because that was the last place that people went before they were shipped out, and so from the roof you could see Siberia. Was the joke. So basement was really the last stop before Siberia. The basement had some isolation chambers, about the size of a phone booth, like one person isolation. It just would be dark. There would be nothing you could do except really stand up, really scrunch down. It was just, you know, why do that? Why? I could not go in the execution chamber, and some of my classmates had gone off into that piece of the basement, and suddenly realized I am down there by myself. The museum's getting close to closing, and they had gone on up the stairs, and I had gotten stopped looking at a small room, and I recognized its purpose from those stories long ago in the Bridget Andau. So here's this room. It's about 10 by 16, and it has a lot of it's sunken down below the floor of the basement, so it goes down about another 2 feet. And this lower part, it's painted with that pool blue that pools are always painted with, kind of up to the level of the basement floor. So there would have been water in there. And in that room, are all these little toadstool-shaped concrete pedestals with a slightly curved top, also painted blue, just below the top of the water, so that your feet would be in cold, icy water, and you'd be trying to stand on top of this slippery little toadstool. And there's space just enough far apart that you'd be tempted maybe to reach out to your neighbor to steady yourself, or to reach out to steady your neighbor if you were, were being kind. But any movement like that would bring a beating, a punishment. To slip and fall off the pedestal into the water, not only would you now be wet and colder, but would also bring on a beating, and back you'd go up on the pedestal. All of that, as I am looking at this room, with my background in architecture and the construction industry, I'm looking at this room and I'm thinking, somebody had to write the functional program for this room. What was its purpose? What was it trying to do? Somebody had to decide what that distance needed to be, what the spacing was. It had to be designed to serve this purpose. It had to be designed by somebody to serve this purpose. It had to be drawn, detailed, the specifications written. What kind of concrete? Pick that color of blue. How many coats of paint? All those really mundane things that go into putting together the design for building something, and then it had to be built by somebody. And all of these people in that whole process were part of creating that torture, that experience. It's not just the former, in this case, some of the former collaborators with the Germans, or the former Soviet people who had Soviet torture experts who had taught the Lithuanians. It wasn't just those people; those are the obvious evil people. It's all that ordinariness that really struck me as I was looking at that chamber in Vilnius. So that was 2008. 15 years later, we are touring in Budapest, and they have it's called the House of Terror. It's the Museum of Terror. It is dedicated to telling the story of life under the Soviets, of the 1956 revolution, and of the resilience of the Hungarian people in resisting that oppression. And it's in the same building, a pretty ordinary apartment building, really, that was built in the 1800s and was converted to secret police headquarters. And the museum was very deftly designed. You came in, you started at the second floor, and you wound your way around through all the exhibits that are telling the story of what happened, just the basic what happened, when. The stories of people, interviews with people who had lived through those times, and down to the last stop the last stop is the basement. And it was just like Lithuania. I mean, not only was there a design, it was a standardized design. This was nothing unusual about it. It had been programmed, designed, detailed. They had borrowed details from another project. It's just, how could they? How can humans do that to each other? How do we do that to each other? How do we dehumanize each other to the point where we can sit at a desk and draw this and put it out to bids and check to make sure all the concrete's in the right place? How do you do that? Right? That's an equally hard question to, what would drive me to run out in front of a tank and stick a piece of pipe in the treads? What drives somebody to that kind of courage on display? What lets someone sink into that morass of inhumanity? How does that happen? Those are really hard questions. I got a couple of emails on that column. Not a lot of detailed feedback, a lot of comments from people, but two emails I want to read a little bit from. One is from us. They were both from women with the same name, a Sue and a Susie, which tells me that we're approximately of the same age, quite likely. From Sue in Spokane. Loved your editorial this morning in the Spokesman Review, an inspired bit of writing. Reading The Bridge at Andau when I was in high school made a big impression on me. My ancestors escaped Yugoslavia due to the Russian communists. Thank you for the reminder of how bad things can be when folks don't stand for principle. Also in high school, the nuns at Holy Names Academy asked us, is there anything you believe in strongly enough to give your life for? That question still haunts me. Keep up your good work in writing. Well, Sue, I mean, how could they, you ask? Well, they forgot to act on principle. They acted on consensus, on fear, on just a desire. Maybe they got a kick out of her hurting others. But thank you for your positive feedback, Sue. And haunting questions like that are worth revisiting every now and then. And it was an interesting exercise to write this, I believe, statement. From Susie in Spokane, thanks for the lovely piece you did. Apologies for not making any of the Braver Angels Zoom meetings. She just goes on that she's just been very busy in the evenings. And she said, I think it'd be nice if we could do something like this at Central Library. And she envisions a 5 to 10 minute opening and a 10 to 15 minute period to write maybe 200 words of this, I believe, and then maybe share in small groups. And she acknowledged that this piece, as I wrote it, had been rushed, but she said, but I think there's something about having limitations which gets to the core of the issues, whether there be an outline form or paragraphs. And she tried writing the title, just this, I believe, on a piece of paper, but didn't get any further. I thanked her for the positive feedback and said, it would be a great program at the library. We had this assignment for a couple of weeks, but I was short on time, and I wrote it kind of stream of consciousness with very little wordsmithing just before the meeting where I was to read this contribution. And I was surprised, as I wrote, at how much I really had suppressed my own heritage. I don't think I realized how much I had suppressed my German heritage. So this writing in that kind of a short time period, it's an opportunity for greater self-awareness, and you never know what you're going to discover about yourself. And Susie wrote back after that exchange and said, funny how that stream of consciousness creates a story that can be surprising. And that's why she was suggesting that short form for the library as well. You can try it yourself at home. You don't have to share it with anybody. No need to read it out loud. But give yourself a short time to write this I believe statement about some incident that has really affected you. My German great-grandfather, this is the story in the family, like so many Germans who had been attracted to or recruited to come to the Russian Empire under Peter the Great, he left Lithuania to avoid being pressed into the Tsar's army. And in fact, when I was in the 5th grade, and we had a young man in our class who his family were German immigrants, and they were going to a naturalization service. So our teacher very nicely had a lesson on heritage and asked us each to share where our families were from. And people were going around the room, and there's a lot of German and a lot of Irish, and it's not a lot of variation. And I always wanted to be a little bit different, so when it was my turn to share, I said that my grandfather was a Russian draft dodger. This was during the Vietnam War, and I sort of vaguely knew that was something a little bit rebellious. So my great grandfather, the Russian draft dodger, had to send for his wife, son, and my future grandmother a few years later, after he is supposedly hid out in the cornfield in a pit with stalks over it as the Cossacks came through. Or at least that's the story I have. And I'm getting ready to do some genealogy study on my paternal side the next few years, and we'll see what I can confirm of that story. It may be much less dashing in its details, or it may be more, or it may be just a mundane story of survival. Thanks for joining me on this edition of Forthright. Please subscribe on Substack with or without making a pledge if you'd like emails notifying you of new material. The next podcast will be column and commentary on the column that ran April 20th, kind of the follow-up to this particular podcast.